Think about this. Is gender dysphoria a mental disorder?
Like that.
Well,
Gives off
I have said, and I will continue to maintain, that gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder, whichever DSM you choose to use, is a mental illness.
Political commentator Ben Shapiro isn't afraid to claim that gender dysphoria is a mental disorder. But how did he arrive at that conclusion? In this episode, we're going to take a look at whether or not gender dysphoria should be considered a mental disorder by looking at what a mental disorder is, how the World Health Organization classifies gender dysphoria, and compare it against the American Psychiatric Association. If you think these conversations are as fun as I do, hit those like and subscribe buttons. My name is Chris, and this is the Think Report. On January 3rd, 2023, the U.S. executed Amber McLaughlin by lethal injection. Amber is the first trans person to be executed in the U.S. Many trans rights organizations fought for them not to be executed, not because Amber was innocent, but because they were trans, which is sexist. But the underlying tone here is that there were two unusual features about Amber. One is that they are transgender, and two is that they're violent. If there's one thing I've learned about personality in the last few years, it's that unusual personality traits don't tend to travel alone. For example, highly intelligent people are 20% more likely to be diagnosed with autism, 80% more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, 83% more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety, and 182% more likely to develop at least one mood disorder. When it comes to psychological diseases, people with high cognitive abilities are 213% more likely to have environmental allergies, 108% more likely to have asthma, and 84% more likely to have an autoimmune disease. So, does it strike you as strange that Elon Musk, who has an IQ of 150, also has Asperger's? It shouldn't. I'm not saying that transgender people are highly intelligent or violent. I'm saying that gender dysphoria is an unusual personality trait, and it should be characterized as such, so that we know how to diagnose it, how to treat it, and what other conditions to watch for. So, what is a mental disorder? According to the World Health Organization, a mental disorder is characterized by clinically significant disturbance within an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior. It is usually associated with distress or impairment in important areas of functioning. Mental disorders may also be referred to as mental health conditions. The latter is a broader term covering mental disorders, psychological disabilities, and other mental states associated with significant distress, impairment in functioning, or risk of self-harm. Some examples of mental disorders that the World Health Organization provides include anxiety, depression, bipolar, PTSD, schizophrenia, eating disorders, disruptive behavior and dissocial disorders, neurodevelopment disorders such as ADD, ADHD, and more. So it seems to fit, right? Out of the two requirements for classifying a personality trait as a mental disorder, gender dysphoria appears to meet both requirements, which are a clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior, and two, is usually associated with distress or impairment in important areas of functioning. Both conditions appear to be met. A clinically significant disturbance in an individual's behavior could be like dressing as the opposite sex. Also, it appears to certainly result in distress. Based on this information from the World Health Organization, gender dysphoria must be a mental disorder, right? Well, up until 2019, we would be right. But in 2019, the World Health Organization removed gender dysphoria from the mental disorder classification. So what's happening here? The International Statistical Classification of Disease, or the ICD, is the WHO's documented standards for conditions it reviews. The American Psychiatric Association has its own documents, which we'll get to a bit later. But in the 11th edition of the ICD, published in 2019 by the WHO, they've redefined gender identity-related health. Gender dysphoria or gender incongruence has been moved out of the mental and behavioral disorders chapter and into the new conditions related to sexual health chapter. So sexual health is what it's classified as. The WHO feels that this reflects the current knowledge that trans-related and gender-diverse identities are not conditions of ill health, and that classifying them as such can cause enormous stigma. The World Health Organization goes on to say that inclusion of gender dysphoria in the ICD should ensure transgender people's access to gender-affirming healthcare, as well as adequate health insurance coverage for such services. So wait, so gender dysphoria, or gender incongruence, as the World Health Organization now defines it, is not a mental disorder? These folks seem significantly stressed to me, to the point where they're willing to amputate body parts to relieve their distress. And also, they said that they want to ensure access to gender-affirming care for children, which includes hormone treatment and surgeries. This is the exact opposite of what the American College of Pediatricians has said about the condition. The American College of Pediatricians has said there is no evidence that these types of treatments are safe for children, and that youth transition is experimental. It also stresses that there is currently no scientific support that gender-corrective treatments reduce the risk of suicide in gender-dysphoric children. And also, how does this ensure that trans people have access to care? In some countries, including Japan, individuals require a mental health diagnosis to make a legally recognized change to their gender. This doesn't help them at all. I usually credit the World Health Organization as a reliable source of quality information and sound authority, but this is in stark contrast of everything else I've read about gender dysphoria. So what have they classified it as instead? Well, according to their website, they've reclassified it as a condition related to sexual health. Sexual health-related issues are wide-ranging and encompass sexual orientation, gender identity, sexual expression, relationships, and pleasure. They also include negative consequences or conditions such as HIV, STIs, unintended pregnancy, sexual dysfunction, sexual violence, and harmful practices such as female genital mutilation. What about the emotional distress part? Are we just ignoring that part for now? What about the fact that research shows on average the majority of transgender people with reassignment surgery have higher suicide rates compared to those who don't? What about the massive risks, like cancer, that result from taking hormone therapy for prolonged periods? There is zero mention of these things in the World Health Organization website. Their classification of gender dysphoria seems fairly incomplete. So, naturally, I popped over to the American Psychiatric Association to see what they had to say about the topic. Remember, the ICD was the documented standards that the World Health Organization produces for all the conditions it reviews. The DSM is the document that the American Psychiatric Association produces. The DSM defines gender dysphoria in adolescents and adults as marked incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and their assigned gender, lasting at least 6 months as manifested by at least two of the following: a marked incongruence between one's experienced and expressed gender, a strong desire to be rid of one's primary or secondary sex characteristics, a strong desire for the primary and or secondary sex characteristics of the other gender, a strong desire to be of the other gender, a strong desire to be treated as the other gender, a strong conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender. In order to meet the criteria for the diagnosis, the condition must also be associated with clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So this sounds familiar, right? The definitions aren't too far apart. The difference is in how they apply it. Unlike the World Health Organization, the American Psychiatric Association's classification of gender dysphoria does align very well with their definition of a mental disorder. To summarize this, I found a comparison in the World Psychiatry Journal that compares the documents from the World Health Organization and the American Psychiatric Association. Remember, the ICD is the WHO document, and the DSM is the American Psychiatric Association's document. As you can see, gender dysphoria is listed as a mental disorder in the American Psychiatric Association and not in the World Health Organization. So, is gender dysphoria a mental disorder? Well, I suppose it depends on who you ask. If you ask the World Health Organization, no. If you ask the American Psychiatric Association, yes. So why does this matter? Well, it's important that commentators like Ben Shapiro and the rest of us use the same language when we refer to these things. The last thing we want to do is waste time arguing about semantics. Semantics are a distraction for more meaningful conversations like what causes gender dysphoria, how do we prevent it, and if it's a mental disorder, shouldn't we be developing better psychological therapies over hormonal and surgical ones? Using the right language in the right classification is step one. According to Gallup research, 20.8% of Gen Z identifies as LGBT. Other studies have similar numbers. If 1 in 5 people are truly not heterosexual, then how did we procreate over the last 200,000 years? Something is off here. Using the right language and having open dialogue will help us identify if we've done something to ourselves, if we've put something in the water, if all the studies are inaccurate, or if we're just misdiagnosing ourselves. Think about that.
Well, I have said, and I will continue to maintain, that gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder, whichever DSM you choose to use, is a mental illness. That is, and again, God forbid that it should be said with any animus, because this is not said with animus. When people are suffering, these are clearly folks who are suffering. When people are suffering, you shouldn't be saying stuff with animus. I'm not saying that as a gotcha to people who are transgender. The point that I'm making is that when a society begins treating folks who have mental illness as though they are representing an objective reality, they are doing no service to the people who actually suffer from a mental illness.